now I would like to give the floor to Professor Philip McDonough, adjunct professor at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences and director of the Centre for Religion, Human Values and International Relations at Dublin City University, to take the floor.
I think the first thing we learn from Aristotle is that the polis exists by nature. We are, a zoon politikon. I'm sorry for my un-Greek way of pronouncing ancient Greek. And the essence, if you like, of humanity is the ability to reason together about questions of right and wrong. And this is very much in conformity, I think, with Christian thinking. Pope Francis talks about civil and political love. Pope Benedict before him included working for justice among the facets of love. And in Caritas, in Veritate, he spoke of the importance of macro relationships as well as interpersonal relationships. That's the first point from Aristotle. I think the second point from Aristotle is that there is always a dialogical relationship between high-level values and particular decisions. So this is what I think is meant by virtue being stokastiki tu mesu. The virtue is always looking for the right point in the particular situation. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says in Book 10 that he's looking for a political leader capable of connecting his intimation of noble and divine things to particular decisions. The German Catholic jurist who died a few years ago, Ernst Wolfgang Buchenförder, had the famous thesis that democracy depends on conditions that it cannot itself guarantee or generate. So this dialogical relationship between high-level values and the particular is essential if we're to understand politics. And I think ultimately that's where the stance of Antigone comes from. It's where the Stoic martyrs in the first century came from. And of course, it leads to the whole tradition of Christian witness. I think Aristotle's third big point is the importance of friendship, philia, which is more important than law. That's a major thesis of the Nicomachean Ethics. And I think that ties in with what Pope Francis says in Evangelii Gaudium, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts in a functioning society. And I come now to Aristotle's key word, and this brings me to how I think in the Christian revelation we can see more than Aristotle saw. Aristotle's key word is koinonia. So in the Politics, where he talks about man as a political animal, he goes on to say that the basis of the household or the polis is this shared life, this koinonia, which of course comes into the New Testament, and then it comes into Christian traditions also through the Latin translation communio. I want to point out three ways in which the Christian tradition builds on Aristotle. The first is when St. Paul says there's neither master, slave, Jew or Greek, man or woman in Christ, because these distinctions between the male citizen and women, foreigners and slaves are at the very heart of Aristotle. Secondly, I think when Aristotle talks about koinonia or sharing, he's often thinking of vision or values or virtues, whereas in the Christian tradition, we come down to sharing bread, basically. So in the letter to Philemon, when St. Paul appears to send the slave back to the slave household, he tells the master that, remember, your slave is also your koinonos. He belongs to the koinonia. And if this is considered, we see that it's impossible for the master to treat the slave like a slave, because the master was entitled, for example, to break up slave families and to do all sorts of things which would be contradicted by what St. Paul says. And the third point, of course, is it's based on the fact that Alexander the Great was the world's worst pupil, because just when Aristotle was praising the polis, Alexander was going across the known world, creating an entirely different form of polity. And that led to the concept of the cosmopolites, the citizen of the world. It led to the idea in the epistle to Epignetus that the Christian is always a paroikos, always a resident alien in any human community because of his wider citizenship in the church. And of course it leads to St. Augustine, securus judicat orbis terrarum. We judge safely when we judge as the whole world. So having made these points, I'd just like to make three practical proposals based on an Aristotelian vision enriched by Christian revelation. And the first is the need for spaces for dialogue where we can look at this dialogical relationship between high-level values and practical politics. And Article 17 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union is a perfect place to begin. I think it's unique in the world. Secondly, we have to look at global frameworks of engagement, and I don't see any place to begin other than the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not going in the right direction. Agenda 2030 will not be fulfilled, but we need to go back and look at this vision of a common plan for humanity. And then finally, there's the question of the agenda for this renewal of a global agenda, where we can draw on such great documents as the document for human fraternity agreed between Pope Francis and the Sunni tradition in Abu Dhabi in 2019. And I think food has to go right up the agenda. In Africa, many African countries, up to 40% of the population will face acute hunger during this year, while the global budget for weapons is $2,300 billion and increasing. This brings one to a second question, which is war. Aristotle says that war is an aspect of the hunting of wild beasts, A.U.Th. And for Aristotle, the whole legitimacy of war is premised on this two-tier understanding of humanity, that there are some people who simply have to be subjugated. A third issue, obviously, is money. And here we can go back to Aristotle as well, because Aristotle points out that money was originally a means of exchange, but then you had krematistike, or however you pronounce it, which is the accumulation of money, which begins to change all human relationships. And then finally, we have AI and technology. I don't see how we can come to any kind of comfortable position on AI unless we also answer the question of Socrates. Again, I apologize for my bad pronunciation, but poste zein. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you,
Professor. Ευχαριστούμε τον καθηγητή.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Konstantinos Christou, Professor at the Faculty of Theology at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. You have the floor. Thank you, Chair. We all know that it's impossible to interpret European culture both in its Orthodox version and its pro-Catholic and pro-Protestant version. It has offered to us the meaning of deepening personal self-consciousness, national consciousness, self-improvement, and reflection based on Christian experience and its needs. We also see this sense on art in all European cities where a Christian element is dominant. It is also impossible to comprehend the existence of medieval European cities and countries without Christianity. Despite its ecumenical message, it reinforced the new kingdoms established in Roman lands. In the Old Testament, its role is obvious, and in the New Testament, the dissemination of the message of God affects all states, and therefore Christianity plays a major role. That's why throughout the Middle Ages, amongst the key elements of the nation, we also have faith, and there's an attempt to deify the national consciousness. It is strengthened by saying that we have the correct faith. This is the case both for Western Europe and for Orthodox Eastern Europe. In our area, we have the establishment of state when they were Christianized, the Bulgarians, the Russians, the Serbs. And they became nations through their religion because that's what homogenized their population. And through Christianity, they received from Byzantium a written civilization and everything that a medieval state comprised. Christianity favored the creation of these states, but was also a unifying force from a religious and cultural aspect for the whole of Europe. And there was this feeling of European unity from that time, helping to create also a system of political balances up to about this World War that was when it deteriorated because of the conflict of power for absolute dominance. We see, therefore, that religion and Christian organization was important from the Middle Ages and to the present. The will of the absolute monarchies of Europe, whose power then went to constitutional regimes, was to control the churches in the countries, and that's what the monarchs of the West did and what Peter the Great did in Orthodox Russia. From then until recent times, the Church uses the state for its own goals as we move forward to our times. And now, more and more, the state is instrumentalizing church and faith in order to achieve its own purposes. For example, in order to have aggressive wars. In defensive wars, it was self-evident that it would participate after all. In the period of the Enlightenment, the rationale followed, and following the romantic reaction to all these attempts, the nation becomes the hero figure and the state as a result. And that's why we see that when the nation states were reformed after the Ottoman occupation ended, ecclesiastical issues rose to the surface with regard to the issues of independence and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. That's why both the Greeks, Serbs, and Bulgarians claimed and acquired their own autocephalous churches. But let's not forget that's what Bulgarians and Serbs also did in the Middle Ages. Showing up the nation state as the ultimate value automatically put the churches in a subordinate position compared to the past. The voluntary and also obligatory alliance of the churches with the relevant governments predominated also in certain countries with regard to foreign policies and war tactics throughout the 20th century and even to this day. Nevertheless, Christianity never stopped being a strong, real power, and this was shown with the victory of the Orthodox churches of the East against the communist regimes, despite the strict persecution. Its martyrs showed the inability of these regimes to dominate people's consciousness by putting forward their own anthropology and their own perspective on society. Martyrdom and the persecution during the predominance of the Soviet system in the end paid fruit, but bore fruit. Church now seems to be isolated from public life in Europe and removed from institutional texts, which seems to affect the multiculturalism that is promoted today. The West is now giving up its history and civilization with the pretext that it wants to conquer the present without being pulled down by the past. And the whole of the planet seems to return, nevertheless, to its historical past in order to draft its future. If the Church needs to go away from its secular claims, this cannot be the case for Christian people, which means that churches selectively decide on their position with regard to secular questions. What can the Church offer Europe today? in a world that is unified from a technological and communicational perspective, but also a world that is fragmented politically. The work in a circularized environment open to the lessons of history in a constructive manner, the Church should provide the freedom of the Greek Church people, its true content, in order to nurture European unity, which can be none other than unity within the civilization and the Christian values it has created. Thank you.
Τώρα θα δώσω το λόγο στο διδάκτορα.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. The next speaker is Dr. Kostas Migdalis, advisor of the Interparliamentary Assembly on Orthodoxy, one of the key figures, one of the main contributors to this conference. Mr. Migdalis. Ladies and gentlemen, recently there's a trend having in mind the difficult position in which Patriarch Kirill is being found as a counterweight to a barbaric war in his country. There's a trend that is reflected in a great article of an American diplomat, Mike Warren David. You may have read it. What does he say in brief? Why bother? Orthodoxy is like that everywhere. Athenagoras was a CIA agent, a very well-known agent. We know this story. I want to point something out because I'm afraid we'll be listening to absurd points. Other than this nonsense, we'll be receiving information that has nothing to do with reality, and we cannot accept them as real. See how Athenagoras rescued unity among Christians, where in 1949 the Holy See's decree on incompatibility between communism and Christianity has just been issued. Following 2 years of intense negotiations by between Marion Taylor, diplomat, and the Pope, the decree is issued, and it creates this huge tension in the Catholic world. I remind you, in Italy, Togliatti was very strong. The Communist Party was the second strongest party. And Taylor goes to Istanbul in order to meet Athenagoras, very well-known Athenagoras, who flew on Truman's plane, to tell him the Pope did condemn communism, now it's your turn. Athenagoras had only one meeting with him and explained to him, as part of my PhD thesis, archives from the Greek Foreign Ministry. What did Athenagoras tell him? First of all, we don't have the same structure. I'm not like Pope. I'm not like the Pope. I can't condemn on behalf of the whole of Orthodoxy. A synod should proceed. 50 or 60 years of communism is not that long so as for me to undermine the relationship between mother and daughter, i.e. the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Russia. Athenagoras could have easily condemned communism if he were an agent. But he avoided that. And the letter of the consul at the time to the ministry expressed sort of panic for Athenagoras is leaving this meeting. And then in 1963, on the island of Rhodes, I think it's important to remember that, 49, 63 inroads, and then 50 years later, we are on Crete and witness similar conduct. That's one point. Number two, as an answer to what we were invited to do by Stavros Zimas, in view of contributing to the creation of a sort of United Nations of Christianity. Well, I think at the I.A.O. we've been following developments since the establishment of our organization. How can it be possible for us Christians, starting from Prodi, and you all know what sort of person Prodi was and how he wanted Christian values reflected in the European framework, how can we have moved to today's ridiculous situation, having 340 pages on the future of Europe without one single mention, a reference to Christian values? All of this was done in secret. Why did it happen? Because all of us abandoned the notion of Christian values to the hands of the churches. And the churches forgot about defending them. Social bodies did not defend them. Politicians omitted. And little by little, in a context lacking transparency, without any consultation with the community or the European Parliament, we moved from Prodi to Lisbon, Article 17, and end up shaking hands with the chairperson of the European Parliament and be happy about that. Who is responsible for this development? First of all of us who left that in the hands of the churches and are now buying into the fairy tale of European values. How can there be European values without Christian values? Europe started 2 world wars. Europe had Stalin. How can we forget about that? An eroded leadership that has accumulated wealth in the private sector without any respect for the rule of law, is it entitled to speak about values? We are responsible for this erosion of the European vision because we abandoned our faith and our power, the people's power, to impose what they believe in, Christian values. The Interparliamentary Assembly on Orthodoxy pointed out that this mechanism you set up in order to discuss the future of Europe does not give any opportunity for us to discuss Christian values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Migdalis. And now, the floor to Reverend Dimitris Boukis, Secretary of the Executive Committee of the Synod of the Evangelical Church of Greece. Thank you. It is very difficult for one to continue after this very vibrant presentation by Professor, but I believe it is a dual issue. There is a dual issue at hand. On the one hand is what we can do as churches, and secondly, what all those who are the members of our churches and who hold significant positions in the politics of Europe, what they can offer. The issue of the relationships between national interests and Christian values has oftentimes been instrumentalized on both sides. And this is one of the key problems in Europe today, in my opinion. It is not something new. It has existed almost from the time when Christian values deteriorated international values. And I say deteriorated, why? The value of Christianity is in its modus operandi, let's say, not in its value. That is how this value appears and is experienced. When other authorities instrumentalize difficulties that may exist between Christian dogma or what we call conservative and progressive flows in our churches, and one party finds itself against the other, or one country finds itself against another within this context. For example, the Protestant community in Greece is very small, but during the bailout times, one of the problems, one of the key messages we got was that the Lutheran Calvinists, the bad people of Europe, are trying to impose things on us that we do not want. The other Christian communities in Greece said nothing against the Lutheran Calvinists in this case. And even worse is the situation on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean today. The progressive and conservative churches are split as to which president they will support and which agenda. So what we need to do is to see how we operate as a church more carefully. And I believe that the challenge set by Mr. Timmermans is very important. I don't think we can have a united nation of the church. That is not possible. I think we should focus on society, and we need to find common ways in order to jointly express our truth. And a very good instrument in order to do this is CEC, the Conference of European Churches. It is a space where we can speak openly. Our goal is not to assimilate one another. Our goal is to have a common way forward to truth and justice as churches, and to impose this in our own way on those who govern us, rather than using us whenever elections are pending. I have seen more politicians in our churches recently than I have seen in the last 4 years, and some of the faithful that come every Sunday. Everybody is looking for votes, and we tolerate this because they sit at the front pew and they're the first to take communion. So this instrumentalization also degrades us in the eyes of the people and of our values. I believe that it is absolutely true that European civilization is based on the Christian ethos. We're not talking about ethics, values, ethos, character, I mean by this. And the European Union, through the eyes of Schuman, who began to think of what would happen, Adenauer, de Gaulle, are all based on this common Christian past that was also the vehicle in order for this all to begin. So maybe we need to rethink us, that is, how such fora can be used in order to promote precisely this Christian character that I refer to. We need to move away from this de-sanctification. The political and the business world is not de-sanctified. It is as sanctified as our churches. This is the discourse that we need to speak and practice. What we do in church should not be separated from sanctity. For example, a church in France cannot use the sign of the cross in soup kitchens. We need to demand that this should be allowed because it's the church giving in this case, so it should be able to use its own symbols. So I think we need to take action in this case, but that also bears a certain cost. On the other hand, we should not embrace political leadership, because we saw that happening in Nazi Germany. We see it happening also in communist Europe. We see it happening right now in Russia. And also this is done in an underhanded manner in the US, in various ways. That is not healthy either. So on the one hand, I think there's a need for self-criticism. On the other hand, I think we need to disengage from all this. We need also to sanctify all those sectors that they tell us not to. We need to move out of the private sphere, go into the public sphere, and to claim through our ethos this difference that we proclaim. And only in this way will we be able once again to bring back one of those basic aspects and take those key initial steps that made Christianity the basis of Western civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Thank you to all the panelists. Mr. Tsipras had to leave. Having listened to the views of the panelists, it's clear that there's a lot of diversity, both in the way they presented their views and in the content. There's plenty of material to be discussed. I'm in the unpleasant position of being the moderator. I'll try to help you take turns. Please, no comments, but questions that will give our panelists an opportunity to express their views for a second round. Who would like to take the floor? Please introduce yourself. Christ is risen. I have a question about the role of international ecclesiastical organizations in Europe and worldwide. And this also brings me to the future of COMECE and the World Church Council. When these organizations were established, I'm talking about the Conference of European Churches and the Commission of Bishops Conference of the EU, the Ecumenical Patriarchate made a major contribution both during the structure phase and its evolution. What you presented to us is true, but it's the past of a church. Many things happened in the triptych justice, peace, and protection of the natural environment. The World Council of Churches also contributed. The Orthodox fought from inside, and what Mr. Migdalis said about the new philosophy is no news. It has been cultivated and fostered for years in these international organizations. My question, and I think it is important, is the following. What is the future of these organizations? What is their vision about the future, not the past? The future of the European Union, the future of the world. The church reached out to citizens, to the community, to politics at the time. Now it's completely different. The Interparliamentary Assembly on Orthodoxy is trying to reach out to the church without any invitation. As Mr. Boukis said, a plea for the church being a way of life and a specific conduct for European citizens. Please, Mr. Zorbas, you'll be moderating one of the panels. If you speak for 5 minutes, how can we have time to answer? I'm sorry. Panelists need some time to answer. Very briefly, I don't want to take up your time. This is a huge question. All of us are concerned about the future of the World Council of Churches and the Conference of European Churches. The former Secretary General said if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. The challenges for churches are numerous, but they can respond. But there's a time lag, a décalage between the experts and the faithful. And we need information. There's an information gap, and the churches themselves, the faithful, cannot engage in the necessary activities. But the World Council and the conference, as Alexandros Papaderos said, based on Plato, these organizations need, or may rather, stimulate churches, can give them a wake-up call. There are many challenges, 3 wars going on at a time, at this time, and very few people discuss about that in Greece or Europe. The churches do speak, not as loud as they should, but it's the leadership that speaks. This has to go down to the faithful and the civil society, otherwise there will be no future. Thank you.
Please announce your name and capacity. Distinguished Chair, distinguished Secretary General, distinguished participants and guests of this International Political Conference, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for us to be here in Thessaloniki. Internationally speaking, times are very harsh, and the future of humanity largely depends on Christian values and the structure of society. For many years, the Interparliamentary Assembly of Orthodoxy has served as a valuable platform for addressing issues arising from the intersection of different cultures and traditions. Dear colleagues, I'm certain that everyone present here is in favor of preserving the role of Christian culture as a bridge for intercultural dialogue and a unifying force. Yesterday, at a meeting of the Secretariat, we adopted amendments to the founding act of the Assembly, and one point of this document is very relevant to today's situation. One of the main goals of the Assembly is to contribute to the preservation of Christian monuments that are in a state of danger and risk having their use changed. In this context, the Armenian side would like to express once again its concern about the safety of the spiritual, cultural, and historical monuments of Nagorno-Karabakh. Very little time has passed since the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, when the Armenian population, who had lived there for thousands of years, was completely expelled within a few days under the threat of physical annihilation. Since autumn 2020, Armenia has on numerous occasions urged the international community to take into account Azerbaijan's policy of destroying, desecrating, and appropriating Armenian religious and cultural heritage. There are a great number of photos and videos confirming cases of vandalism and destruction, such as the targeted bombing of the Church of the Holy Old Savior Gaza Church in Shushi, and the distortion of the appearance of the temple and destruction of the Armenian Church of St. John the Baptist and the Church of the Holy Mother of God in Mecca. In these videos, we see Azerbaijani soldiers shooting at crosses in churches, demolishing the walls of ancient monasteries and fortresses, and destroying monuments and entire cemeteries. Such actions clearly demonstrate the desire of Azerbaijan to completely erase the memory of the indigenous people of the region and their heritage as soon as possible. At the same time, Azerbaijan is denying access to the UNESCO mission, who desire to monitor and access the condition of cultural sites and monuments in this area. However, in the absence of monitoring, these sites will have the same destiny as Armenian cultural heritage in other parts of modern Azerbaijan have undergone, especially in Nakhchivan, where tens of thousands of Armenian artifacts have been wiped off the face of the earth since the 1990s. Dear colleagues, the issue of preserving the Armenian heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh concerns us all, since it directly affects our Christian identity, and we call upon the I.A.O. to use all tools at its disposal in order to contribute to the preservation of the Armenian religious heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh. I would like to particularly note the statement of organization on the need to protect the Christian monuments of Artsakh, which was adopted in 2021, and also underline the peacekeeping role of the Assembly in relation to this extremely important humanitarian issue. In violation of the international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, Azerbaijan continues to hold at least 23 Armenian prisoners officially confirmed by Azerbaijan. And I would like to emphasize within this context the importance of the Assembly's support in preserving the vital norms of international law. Dear colleagues, I am confident that we need to continue actively participating in international events and contribute to the further promotion of international cooperation, taking into account the significant role of Christian values in the establishment of democracy and peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. But this statement is not relevant to the topic. It's not directly related to this panel. Are there any other persons who wish to make similar statements? This is not a part of the plans for this panel. I did not interrupt the speaker since he's a guest, but would any of the panelists like to comment on that? Mr. Migdalis? The distinguished member of parliament brought this issue up here and not during yesterday's meeting of the Secretariat, because we believe that this is a case in point reflecting the inability of state entities to protect expressions of Christian values, such as churches. And that was the perspective the Member of Parliament wanted to share with you. Thank you. Okay then. We have more time for the coffee break. There's no need to keep our panelists here any longer. Thanks to all of you. I sounded very strict, but that was the instructions I had. Coffee break until 12.